Hello there, my dear friends and all of you wonderful viewers. I would like to warmly welcome you to today's video. Today, I am very interested in sharing my point of view. And so I am sharing this with you today so that you also have a very compelling reason to deeply reflect on the following points that I'm about to mention. On what? The difference between a world without Trump and Pence. A world with Trump and Pence. First of all, I would like to say that often when reading comments, watching videos, and various discussions and debates, I come to the conclusion that the many people live in an illusory world where they are not interested in their own future or the future of their country. For them, what matters is, for example, that Trump is not in power or that he did not hand over power to Pence. That's their attitude toward life. That is, maybe your house is already destroyed, but for you, what matters are the presidents and leaders of the United States, who, in principle, have nothing to do with you, nor you with them. But it seems to you that it is precisely their policies that lead to your problems. This is the result of informational noise. This is the result of when mass media shape a certain opinion. And today I want to talk to you about how this happens. But I will talk about it in the second part of today's broadcast. Now, I would like to talk about this is the stark difference between the complex world of the so-called Democrats and our own. And we will discuss what today's democracy is and the world of the Republicans. Since the United States is the #1 country on the planet, it is logical that depending on who is in power in the US, the policies implemented by the United States and which affect the entire rest of the world also depend on that, specifically on the world. So, what exactly would the world look like without Trump and Pence? And what does the world of Trump and Pence offer us today? It is absolutely crucial for us to understand that there is no such thing as a perfect, harmonious, or beautiful world that exists out there for everyone in any concept. No matter who becomes president, there is no idealized picture of the world where all countries on planet Earth have developed a program and think only about people. Such a world does not exist. And even if all the ideas of the President of the United States, Donald Trump, are implemented, such a world still will not exist. To some extent, such a world might exist within the United States. To some extent, in those countries that will adopt the ideology which is fundamental for Donald. But there will be no good, wonderful, idealized world drawn for everyone. This does not exist and cannot exist. It's roughly the same thing with the Democrats, with the globalists, but the situation there is different. There, a certain unified, identical world for everyone is envisioned. We'll talk about that too. Now, let us take a moment to imagine the future global landscape without the presence of Trump and Pence, specifically a scenario where they fail to win their re-election bids, or perhaps a situation where, following their time in office, the Democrat globalist coalition successfully returned to power once again to lead the nation. What will happen then? Without emotion, without any bias. In other words, the process will accelerate. The blurring of traditional boundaries. This is what will happen first and foremost in Europe. That is freedom of movement, humanitarian regimes, supranational norms. They will completely prevail over national sovereignty. So it will be an entirely open and accessible space, but it is intended to be open and comfortable, not specifically for the benefit of Europeans, since it will be a truly supranational space, but rather for the ever new and continuous global waves of incoming migrants arriving from all over the world. In other words, borders will remain only formally, but they will have completely lost their function as filters. So that will no longer exist. In fact, according to the theory, all of Europe will turn into a base, a territory of free movement of people and capital. And it will not be regulated by any external perimeters. borders will become merely administrative lines. They will no longer serve as protection for demographic or cultural structures. That is not envisioned at all. Accordingly, the role of Europe is that of a center, a space that increasingly attracts migration, mainly from the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. This will completely change the social and political balance. The role of Muslim communities will not just increase, they will become predominant. The influence of Islamic religious identity in the public sphere will grow, while Europe will lose the remaining influences of a Christian secular continent. And more, for everyone except Muslims, it will become a post-national, multi-confessional space. In other words, it will have to be acknowledged that the European peoples we know from classical literature and tradition will simply cease to exist. This is a complete loss of their political dominance. That is, any ability to form a long-term unified strategy in the future will also be lost. This is the kind of plan, the kind of world, the kind of vision being proposed. By the way, in such a world, it would also be quite uncomfortable and difficult for Israel to survive, for example, because Israel is, after all, a right-leaning state. The strategic position and geopolitical standing of Israel in such a changing world will inevitably become much more complicated. This is because the gradual erosion of the cultural foundations and civilizational solidarity that once defined Europe, combined with the steady growth of Islamic influence across the continent, will mean a significant decline in traditional support. As new diasporas eventually replace the older European populations, these demographic shifts will fundamentally redirect the strategic priorities and ideological focus of the emerging Western elites. Allied commitments will be balanced against humanitarian positions. That is, this will lead to a situation where even if Israel maintains a formal partnership with continental Europe and the Anglo-Saxon world, in reality it will be isolated in public opinion. Speaking of the countries of Eastern Europe and the Christian countries of the South Caucasus, Georgia, and Armenia, in such a case, they will be completely overwhelmed by the demographic wave. So, my dear friends, the future world that will eventually be built is going to be incredibly comfortable for those people, and it will truly be a wonderful place to live. Who obviously are not watching my channel, let me put it this way. After all, mass migration flows will be redistributed not only within Western Europe. Most of the movement will already be directed toward Eastern Europe. This is only natural. In other words, this will make the region of Eastern Europe especially vulnerable to the settlement of new masses of people. Take Ukraine, for example, which today is in a severe conflict, at war, and suffering demographic exhaustion. And of course, in such a new world, it will be seen as a space for long-term migration compensation. That is, in fact, this will become an element of the new pan-European balance. But this will create serious tensions, though of course they will be temporary, between the tasks of restoring the state and the changes in its social structure. Because once the social structure changes, there will be no more tension. For Armenia, for example, in a hypothetical world, this is my message to those commentators who are very worried that Trump is in power. It's not a given that Trump will even be able to implement his ideas. But Trump is the only hope in just one respect. Why do I talk about his ideas? Because national states would be preserved, European Europe would remain, and perhaps he could turn the situation around so that traditional America would endure. Otherwise, I'll tell you, including for Armenia, what this world would look like without Trump and without Vance. Commentators and viewers are very concerned, believing that the root of their problems lies precisely with Trump and Vance. In this program, so a world of blurred borders without Trump and Vance will bring many surprises for Armenia. A small country with a fragile demographic balance and a complex regional environment will find itself included in migration routes, and not in the way it is today. For example, there is currently a certain migration flow from South Asia, from Bangladesh, India, and other countries, and this is noticeable in Yerevan. But it will be on a completely different level when this flow becomes a very significant part of Armenia's population. And Armenia will no longer be able to regulate these migration flows on its own initiative. Instead, it will operate according to the logic of supranational decisions and humanitarian obligations that it will be required to fulfill. And in the absence of strong state will, what is called institutional will, this will simply lead to a complete change in the internal structure of society faster. The structure of society will change faster than a mechanism for integration can be formed, especially since it is impossible to integrate precisely those groups that will be coming to Armenia. That is, if Christians from the Middle East, for example, Copts, Alawites, or Zazas from Turkey, were coming to Armenia, then they would integrate into the Armenian nation. But since the people coming will be from Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, there will be no integration at all. This will be a challenge that Armenia will not be able to handle. It's kind of a greeting to those outstanding thinkers who are eagerly waiting for Trump to either lose or for his power to fade. Well, you'll see what you fought for, basically, what you dreamed of. Such a world is not a conspiracy, it's simply a program. Let's put it this way, it's a project for a single people. There will be elites who have everything. The ability to move around to control the situation, well, that's what they think. To live in safety. This will be a small part of the Earth's population, and the rest will be a mixed population without culture. Because when you mix all cultures together and remove the cultural and national component, all that's left as culture is Coca-Cola and hamburgers. And photos of a certain kind of beauty on Facebook, TikTok, and so on, which you know about. And there would be no cultural distinctions. That is, there will be no political protection for any form of culture. Nowhere, not in Armenia, not in Ukraine, not in any other country. Everything will simply be erased. Because this will be a world where large systems, supranational structures, the biggest corporations, small states, medium states, and historic peoples will win. They will simply be absorbed into this world and will simply lose their subjectivity. That's roughly what it will look like. No one is promising a beautiful future. I've said this before, even if Trump manages to carry out his plans. That future does not exist under any circumstances. The future exists and depends on the efforts of each individual person and group of people. Hoping that someone else will do something and everything will turn out well is childish infantilism. Why is everything happening this way? The fact is that classical democracy and the democracy we have today are two completely different systems. Classical democracy has features that are quite clearly meritocratic, where the best are chosen and governed in order to provide the best opportunities for life. In our time on Earth, especially for immature communities and peoples, a kleptocratic ochlocracy, that is the rule of thieves over the crowd, so-called thieves over the so-called crowd, is called democracy, where in order to win elections, all you need is money. How does this work? For example, a focus group is selected from 70% of the population. They study what the focus group wants. In the form of slogans and pretty pictures, this group is given what it wants. Temporarily. For a month or a month and a half after the victory. And then it becomes very easy to control this group because they are uneducated. They don't understand the situation, and it's very easy to do this. Look, for example, how did the special services in Russia manage to do this? People were stuffed, although in fact they've been stuffed for hundreds of years, with ideas about the Russian world, about victory in World War II as seen through Russia, the Great Patriotic War, and so on. This includes the corresponding films, the work, the need to rise from our knees, and all that sort of thing. Everything that every person in Russia, for example, wanted to hear. Someone who never had the chance to live their one and only life properly, when you can't get good medical care, can't eat well, have a decent job, or feel safe, then, in order to control you, they need to give you some kind of idea, implant it in you, and use that idea to manage you. That's also how countries are governed, by whom and with the help of European integration, by whom with the help of the fear of renewed war, and so on. Friends, that's why the distinction is very simple. A world without Donald Trump, and perhaps such a world will exist because it's not certain he'll be able to achieve his goals. It's a world without borders. And this world will hit the European post-Christian component the hardest of planet Earth. It simply won't exist. I'm telling you how it is, not in any form. Maybe the name Europe will temporarily remain. But demographically, Europe will consist of people from Africa and Asia. And Europeans will be a minority. And of course, no one will protect them. And the people who are organizing all this will simply be making money. That's basically the plan. There can be many variations. And of course, no one can stand alone. And Poland won't be able to resist on its own if things unfold this way. With the potential leadership of Trump and someone like Vance, there exists a distinct possibility that nation states and culture will be protected and preserved for the future. That if you're used to an English breakfast, or, for example, Armenian scrambled eggs, or in Central Asia, besh barmak, then you'll have the opportunity to continue living within the culture you're accustomed to. That's the whole difference. But it's a very significant one. Very significant. Life is already not easy. It's complicated. There are a lot of problems. There are health issues, social issues. You also have to earn a living in this life. It's already complicated as it is. But when, for example, living in a hypothetical Eastern European country, you also have to be afraid to go out to the store to buy kefir because large segments of the population are unable to integrate, but it's profitable for corporations to bring them in and use them to stay in power, to control the streets. Well, that's what happens. Your life will simply become even harder. And then narratives and accounts regarding restricted scandals like these, it is essentially like a massive information dump, much like the complex situation we saw with Epstein, will eventually just become entirely ordinary and commonplace occurrences in our daily lives. In other words, only a very small elite whom you will never see will live well. And you'll only meet them if they'll take an interest in someone from your family, just like Epstein did. That's the kind of scenario we're talking about. Yes. Other than that, in this situation, there is only a very slim and narrow possibility, a small chance to survive, and we must somehow find a way to integrate ourselves into the existing system, where conditions might not end up being quite as dire as they otherwise could be. That is the defining period, and the subsequent transition and further transfer of political power, which is possible under the policy pursued by the current American leadership. I'm not sure they'll be able to achieve their goals. There's a tremendous struggle going on there. I'm telling you a lot. It's unclear what this will ultimately lead to, how it will all turn out. No one knows because the struggle is still ongoing. We don't know how China will act, how this struggle will allow China to become stronger or weaker. In any case, at the very least, Trump has a vision of a single war. This is a war between the US and China, not necessarily by military means, but until a certain result is achieved. Trump's opponents have a vision of endless wars that will slowly, bit by bit, wear down nations, especially in Eastern Europe, to go on endlessly. Well, maybe if certain groups of people like that, then that's fine. But I don't think that's good. Aimless wars without achieving anything. Any kind of goal where no one wins but everyone is worn down disappears. In principle, within a single human lifetime, this is the worst scenario. Trump's team has a different vision to stop these wars. Whether it will work out or not, so far things aren't really working out. But if he's not really succeeding, but there's a trend, then in the opposite case, I think everything will work out. I just wanted to share these thoughts with you so that things would become clearer for you. I hope that worked. That's it. Perhaps globalization is already inevitable. Maybe, but if it is inevitable, you more or less understand how it will be and what you'll have to be prepared for. It's the same thing, just in a different form as what the Bolsheviks, communists, and socialists proposed at the beginning of the century. It's the same thing. There are no differences at all. Just different origins, but it's the same global idea. Both the idea of communism and the idea of globalization contradict national projects and national cultures. They contradict a high quality of life in individual regions, in those that have come together and built it, but they offer a common life indistinguishable from one another across all continents. At a certain level of the labor and social masses, while there will be elites who will prosper, and out of 8.5 billion people, millions will not make it into these elites. That's a fact. This is the answer to the comments regarding those people, the viewers, do not understand the current situation. They think that if, for example, if instead of Donald Trump, the Democratic Party comes into power, you might believe that happiness will surely follow. But if your idea of happiness is a state of endless warfare everywhere, the erasure of national borders, opening them up, the absence of borders and global migration flows, of course, it's easy to talk about this when, for example, you're struggling and see people of your own culture. Life isn't easy, but then you'll have to interact with people who don't recognize any culture and believe that they will be the masters of the territory they've come to, where you are the native resident. Do you like such a world? Or do you just not try to think? Or are you simply unable to grasp what is being discussed? We don't even know the final outcome, what kind of world it will be under Trump. There are just the main forms or directions of development, national forms of development. That's Trump, and global ones. There are two options so that you understand how the planet is developing. So humanity has proven capable only of what it has proven capable of two mainstreams, two main global directions. Dear friends, think about this. I'm not even saying that something is good or something is bad. There are simply two versions of how events might unfold. It is going to be either one of these two specific options. Think about it. Thank you for watching me. I'm very glad that the channel has grown so much, and it's a pleasure to speak to an audience that thinks critically. I read the comments, many of them impress me, and there are a lot of them. Today, I wanted to share these thoughts with you, my friends. It's important to look at the situation strategically, not just focus on today. That's about it. So thank you for watching and subscribe, friends. We continue and move forward. Thank you. Goodbye.